Joining us, MS Now political analyst and host of the Fast Politics podcast, Molly Jong-Fast, former Ohio governor and MS Now political analyst, John Kasich, a New York Times opinion columnist, David French. We also want to talk about Marco Rubio and J.D. Vance here and the politics of the presidential politics between them. But let's start with Iran. David, the president is constantly taking questions on Iran, and he's almost never saying anything of real substance, or at least never anything that seems like it's directly tied to what's happening in Iran. A lot of it does seem timed or intended to manipulate the markets. And he talked about the markets just then.
Oh, I don't think there's much question at all. The guy is trying to manipulate the markets throughout this war. He keeps announcing good news on the eve that the markets, the eve of the markets opening. Bad news is reserved for different times. I mean, it's very obvious in this Trump second term about the only thing that actually checks Trump, about the only thing sort of internally in the United States that he actually pays attention to is the status of the market. And he's constantly trying to goose the market to be better and more favorable to him. But in the meantime, on the war itself, he's flailing. He's announcing contradictory goals. He's announcing victory and then not victory, then victory again. It's very obvious that he had one mindset going into this, and that was, this is Venezuela Part 2. That's what this is, Venezuela Part 2. And when it turned out not to be, as it was never going to be, he hasn't had a plan B. He hasn't thought this all the way through. And here we are. We're just flailing from idea to idea, from proposal to proposal, and nobody really knows the true status of the war.
Molly?
I think, look, I'm Jewish, but I'm going to tell you, when you're fighting with the first American Pope, the one who speaks English, the one from Chicago who has huge favorabilities, and by the way, this fight is about nuclear weapons, like the church is against nukes, and supposedly Donald Trump is saying he's trying to get the nukes away from the Iranians. So the fact that he's even fallen into this fight is bizarre. I think you're losing. I think this is not a fight he wants to pick. And he's having a lot of trouble focusing on the problem at hand. And the problem at hand is why he got elected, which is making things cheaper and affordability.
Well, let's talk about the Pope first. Not the Pope, but Marco Rubio's going to visit the Pope. He said this meeting was scheduled before Donald Trump started fighting with him. But it does show us that Marco Rubio has been the person the administration seems to be putting out there whenever they need to smooth something over, or at least that's the message that we're getting. Yesterday at the White House briefing room, Governor Marco Rubio came out and talked to reporters who probably felt like it was nice not to be attacked for a couple minutes by somebody from this administration, and he gave a more coherent justification and explanation for this war than we normally get out of the administration. There is still all sorts of holes to it, but he did message better on it than anybody else had. And he did so with a level of charm, I guess, that we don't normally see. The bar is obviously very low. But it has sparked real conversation out there about what this means for 2028. J.D. Vance had always been the presumed successor, the presumed inheritor of the MAGA movement. He's been trying to court it. But now there's a lot of talk out there about Marco Rubio. You ran against him in 2016, so I wanted you here to talk about it. Do you see him as a viable candidate, a viable inheritor of the MAGA movement?
Well, look, first of all, during those debates, I was the one person that said we shouldn't tear up the agreement with Iran, but that we needed to go back and patch it up in the areas where it was weak. And one was the whole regime of inspections that needed to be fixed. And secondly, the idea that we needed to limit their ability to arm these different groups around the world that were carrying their water. Now we've gone through this war, and it appears as though what's going to happen is that there will be a negotiation going forward about what to do with nuclear weapons. It's kind of interesting, isn't it? A flashback, Katie, in a funny sort of way. So they wanted to tear it up because they didn't like it. And now we might be in a process where we actually didn't deal with the nuclear issue, but we're going to continue to negotiate. And at the same time, we've kind of repelled our allies, including the leader of Poland, which is a very serious issue because the Poles really get to understand what happens if the Russians are on their right on their doorstep. In terms of Rubio, look, Yeah, I think he's the sunny guy. But if you take Rubio and you take Cruz, it's not Cruz, but you take Vance, both of them were basically 180 degrees away from Donald Trump. Rubio was in favor of immigration reform. Then he walked away from it. Vance said at one point he didn't want anything to do with Trump. So it gets to be about, well, who are these guys? And what is the definition of character in regard to those guys? But they're going to be viable. But let me ask you a couple others. How about Don Jr.? Is he maybe going to run? Ted Cruz, he's going to Iowa, not because he likes the corn in Iowa. He's going there because he's trying to set the stage. And then I've got another one for you to think about. What if Thomas Massie actually wins this primary down there in Kentucky? Could he turn around and say he wants to run for president? What we do know about 2028 is we don't know any more than we knew that DeSantis was going to be president or, Mike Pence. We don't even see him anymore, so it's too early. But it's speculation and it's fun, and that's why we do television, right, Katie?
It's speculation, yeah, of course. But it's also we're trying to understand the MAGA movement and where it's going and who is going to take charge of it and where that person might lead it. And the idea that Vance no longer has control of it, I think is really telling because it helps us, or it raises the question about what the MAGA movement is right now. Because I mean, you know this. Vance has gone out there and he's been America first. He lashed himself to Donald Trump after calling him America's heroine only a few years ago. But he really tried to carve a lane for himself on being pro-America and only America. And he has had to twist himself into pretzels in this administration with Donald Trump's foreign, quote unquote, excursions. And it's really coming back to bite him.
I think a more talented politician could probably do a little better. Look, he's a Peter Thiel guy, and Peter Thiel has not had the greatest. I mean, remember Blake Masters in Arizona? He has not done a great job of picking. And what you see, I mean, look.
You said Blake Masters, and I thought who? I
exactly, but remember he ran for Senate. It was a wildly expensive Arizona campaign. And he's just not, I just think J.D. Vance not a great politician, which it's a real skill being a politician. And look, there's a lot of hypocrisy in this administration, but like you're watching Marco Rubio be able to spin it to a certain extent. And I just think Vance barely got elected in Ohio. They had to pour money into that race. And I think he's just not a natural.
So do you think if the MAGA movement, and Sarah Longwell had a great piece, a focus group where a lot of voters, David, were talking about how they thought Vance was just not authentic any longer. They just didn't know who he was. He wasn't principled, but they really liked Marco Rubio. They were really impressed by his performances in front of cameras and his ability to speak to voters. They felt like they understood him as a principled person. We can talk about whether that's real in a moment. But does that say to you that MAGA voters are now, after 10, 11 years of Trump and the craziness of it, maybe they're looking for something more akin to normal?
Well, I mean, I think, look, one thing we just have to acknowledge is that we've had weeks and weeks and weeks of two men, J.D. Vance and Marco Rubio, kind of auditioning in front of the public. And we're relearning why. For years and years, leading up to 2016, a lot of people thought Marco Rubio was a uniquely talented politician. I mean, people compared him to a young Ronald Reagan years and years ago. And then when he collapsed in the 2016 presidential campaign, people just wrote him off. But he's still a talented guy. He's a talented politician, especially if you're going to do the day-to-day contrast with J.D. Vance. But I have a bit of a different theory here, and that is, I don't think if the present trends continue, where this administration is lurching down to the mid and now low 30% approval rating in some polls, I'm not convinced that the heir to the GOP crown is necessarily going to come out of this administration. You had an unpopular administration when George W. Bush finished, and the next Republican nominee was one of Bush's primary critics years earlier, in John McCain. So it's going to be very interesting to see if there's going to be a glow, sort of a halo effect of being a part of this administration, or there's going to be the opposite, that if there's a big midterm loss, if Trump continues to struggle, are Republican voters going to do yet another pivot? Because we've seen the party change before. There's nothing to say it will change again.
So, Governor, do you have an idea of what that, if there is a pivot, what it would look like, given what voters are saying right now about this administration? Again, there are some, hardcore Republicans who are still on board, but independents, biggest voting bloc in this country, not on board. Democrats, obviously not on board. And a meaningful amount of Republicans in this day and age say that Donald Trump is just not focused on them, not doing a good job on the economy, on immigration, on anything, really.
Well, again, it is about affordability. You mentioned it out early on, Katie. And the fact is that people today are feeling as though they're not being listened to. We had about 24% turnout in our primary here yesterday, and somebody was bemoaning it. I said, well, people don't really want to go out and vote because meet the new boss is the same as the old boss. So it is very possible, to David's point, that somebody may come out of this thing that's not tied to the administration. And we're going to have to see. We have a long way to go. We're not even through the midterms, and the midterms will reveal some other things. One other comment, because you brought up the issue of Rubio and the Pope. One of the frustrations I think Donald Trump has is he doesn't understand he's fighting a man whose spirituality runs his life. And it's easy to fight with a politician back and forth. But when you're running against somebody who is really kind of above all that, and you are spiritually driven, it's very difficult to land a punch, and we've seen it, and we've seen the Pope handle himself very well. I wish Rubio good luck over there, and he's got a big job to do.